most frequent request I've gotten for a book review is this one right here, Revolution in the Head by Ian MacDonald. And this has angered many a Beatle fan, and we're going to break it down here on Pop Goes the 60s. So I find this book extremely valuable, and the reason is because MacDonald has a way of explaining the 60s and the cultural events surrounding the Beatles, and it puts the Beatles in the context in the decade from which they came, which is a really important part of understanding their influence and their effect on pop culture long term. The subtitle is called The Beatles, Records, and the 60s, so that's why that subtitle is called that. And this book is... The preface is rather, I would say it's academic, but the bulk of the book is covering the 241 Beatles songs. That's 95% of the book. So that's, I think, what most people tune in for here. And it covers some demos. It also covers all the way up to like Free as a Bird. So he covers just about everything. And he critiques these in a very refreshing and original way. Revolution in the Head came out in 1994, and it's gone through a couple of editions since. Last one being in 2005. Let me read to you a couple of the reviews. So John Harris described it in 2012 as a triumph of musical and cultural scholarship, one of those books that can be reread endlessly. The Guardian's Richard Williams wrote, "No other critic contributed more to an enlightened enjoyment of the work of the Beatles." Stephen Thomas Erlewine calls it a massive achievement, influential, and one of the best books about the Beatles, but added that MacDonald is, quote, not overly generous with his criticism. He's quick to dismiss songs he deems as throwaways. And finally, music journalist John Bergstrom said the book surpassed Mark Lewison's earlier sessions as the de facto factual reference for the group's recording career. So generally, the reviews were pretty positive across the board. The negative reviews come mostly from fans, and I thought it'd be the best way for me to explain this book is to take the negative reviews of some of the fans and refute them with information from the book. So you get a feel for what fans are picking up from this book and what's really in the book. So what I want to do is start with, I went to Amazon, and I don't know if you read Amazon reviews a lot for music. I've always done that. And some are quite good, some are quite bad. And so I want to focus on the negative. Since we heard mostly positive stuff from the professional writers, let's hear what the fans have to say about this book, because I hear lots of negative stuff and it's very poorly substantiated. So the first person here from Amazon is a guy named Perseus. He titles it "MacDonald Needs a New Head." Very wordy and way over analytical. You would think MacDonald is a direct descendant of Freud himself. The detail regarding actual recordings is fun to read, yet despite all the detail and the overlong psychoanalysis, the author left out a key song for some bizarre reason, Sexy Sadie. Sexy Sadie is completely ignored here without explanation. He denigrates it with brio and overanalyzes everything to the point that it becomes a tediously predictable exercise in psycho-bashing most of their music. I wouldn't recommend this book to anybody. Okay, let's have a look at what he actually says here. I've got some notes I can refer to. So Sexy Sadie is in this book. Now I've got the third revision. I can't imagine it would have been missed in the first edition. If anybody has a first edition, let me know. He actually dedicates a little more than a half a page to the song, and he gives all the instrumentation for every song, and for this entry, he talks about where it was written, who it was written about, the basic stuff that most of us already know. But as for the opinion part, this is what he says about it. As usual with Lennon, meaning and musical expression are integrally linked. From the dry chiding of the song's opening phrase to its endlessly maneuvering chord sequence, shifting as evasively as its heroine slips between compromising situations. With a duplicitous echo on the piano, hypnotic phasing on the backing vocals, and an insidious guitar obligato from Harrison, Sexy Sadie is all of an unprepossessing piece. Now, this person calls this bashing, psycho-bashing. So, I mean, it's a little bit wordy, it's a little bit academic, but I wouldn't call that bashing. So this is an example of this particular reviewer's just lack of understanding, lack of musical knowledge as well. So the psycho-bashing most of the Beatles songs here, I went through this book. There are some songs he says good things about, and he says bad things about in the same song. I estimate about 15% negativity in this book. So let's go to the next one here. Lance Houck. Too intellectual for its own good. It thrives on MacDonald seeing himself as a heady intellectual type that knows everything. Well, spoiler alert, he doesn't. For example, in his opinion, he boldly puts forth the idea that Long, Long, Long is Harrison's best work on the White Album. Please, that is just stupid. I love all his songs, but what we have here is not journalism. There's nothing objective about what he writes. It's subjective. He's critiquing the Beatles. Disappointed. That's all I can say. Very disappointed. So here's another example of somebody who cannot handle anything negative said about the Beatles. Yes, there is subjectivity in here, but he says he's critiquing the Beatles. Yes, he is critiquing the Beatles. That's perfectly fine to do. Let me just read to you something in the very beginning of the book here that MacDonald was well aware of before this book even came out. So he says, part of the aim of this book is to replace gushing hero worship with a detached, posterity anticipating tally of what the Beatles did. While this entails some deflation and occasionally a little harsh criticism, the hope is also by avoiding cliches in favor of close examination and context to make the group's music as fresh and exciting as it was when it first appeared. Better still, to deepen its meaning and impact for those who may have missed the decade with which the Beatles dominated. So Lance here is commenting from a very tight Beatle bubble, and many of these comments are from that same perspective. We're going to move over here to Steve. Now this is a very long comment. I'm going to not bore you with all the details of Steve's comment, but he starts by saying, now lay people might think that Revolution in the Head might be absolutely brilliant. Lay people meaning probably you and me. It's also very clear to me that he is not a fan of the Beatles, and he's completely enamored with his opinions and the style in which he writes. Look, I know a bit about music and songwriting. I did a lot of session work and some major well-known talent back in the 70s and 80s. I played keyboards with many of those same bands and people on tour for many years. I'm mentioning this in my review only so the people who read this understand that I am not a neophyte. I know and understand music, great songwriting, and superlative production. I also know garbage. Steve goes on. When MacDonald comes out and says that something wasn't a great song because of the lack of a middle eight, then he needs to have his head examined. So old Steve here, who's not a neophyte, is saying that MacDonald said something wasn't a great song. So let's see what he actually says about the song Something, shall we? So he spends about a page and a quarter, about a page and a half on the song Something. I'm just going to go to his basic conclusion here. Conceded by Lennon to be the best song on Abbey Road, Something is the acme of Harrison's achievement as a writer. Lacking his usual bitter harmonies, it deploys a key structure of classical grace and panoramic effect, supported by George Martin's sympathetic viola-cello countermelody and delicate pizzicato violins through the middle eight. If McCartney wasn't jealous, he should have been. So he's actually calling out the middle eight as something positive. He calls Something is the acme of Harrison's achievement as a writer. That means his high point. So he's praising the song. Yet Steve here, who's not a neophyte, sees that as a rip on the song. Steve goes on to say, George Martin, there's nary a mention of him in MacDonald's work. I don't understand why. George Martin is really the unofficial fifth Beatle. He mentions Martin right in the fucking description of Something. Not only that, but Martin is mentioned in 34 other songs as well. So Steve here, who says nary a mention for George Martin, that means none. Martin's all through this book. You know, it's okay to dislike MacDonald's writing style. It's okay to disagree with his opinions, but people who say that he is unqualified for lack of qualification, it just doesn't have a grasp on the subject at all. They don't know music. And this guy who's played with all these bands, he's a butthurt fanboy. That's all he is. So those were Amazon reviews. Let's go to some Facebook pages here. There was a Facebook Beatle page that recently had a woman on it that was asking about this book, asking, hey, can anybody refer me to this book? What do you think of it? I'd like to give it a try. So we got some mixed reviews here, but some very negative ones. I just want to bring out another negative one or two here. This one's from a guy named John Taylor. So he says, The problem I have with it is it dresses up a highly partisan view with a cloak of musicological objectivity. If it was just some guy's opinion, I wouldn't care. But it sets itself up as a serious analysis with a knowledge of compositional technique to back it up. So what he's saying here, if it was somebody that doesn't have any credentials, that isn't a writer, that doesn't have any background at all in music, then I wouldn't care. The fact is, this guy has credentials, and he's saying something this guy doesn't like, so he does care. So he's pissed. So Ian MacDonald, by the way, he is a Cambridge-educated musician, writer, and assistant editor for the New Musical Express, songwriter, and record producer. So this is not a neophyte, basically. And he is more than qualified to comment on the theory of music, as well as the cultural significance. I'll touch on that a little bit later, but this guy is, he's just a brilliant writer and has such a grasp of the cultural side of not only music, but just culture in general and how this all fits in. It's maybe a bit much for some people, but for others, I think that's what's refreshing about this book. So one of the things that John Taylor continues on here, he says, then he commences the usual hack trick of just cherry-picking academic arguments to back up his existing biases, which is the exact opposite of what musicological critique is supposed to achieve. As a serious piece of work, it has no value at all, in my opinion. Factual errors compounded some very weak analysis, including totally missing the point about Revolution 9, which 50 years on really deserves better than, quote, it's just noise. Okay, we're going to read about Revolution 9 here. I have never read such fine analysis. He spends 5 or 6 pages just on Revolution 9. And this guy says that he boiled it down to MacDonald saying it's just noise. First of all, MacDonald never says that in here. Doesn't say that at all. In fact, let me read to you some of what he does say. So at first, he begins by saying, by far the Beatles' most extreme venture into random. This 8-minute exercise in oral free association is the world's most widely distributed avant-garde artifact. Around 1 million households owned copies of it within days of its release, and a quarter of a century later, its hearers number in the hundreds of millions. One of the most striking instances in the communicative power of pop, Revolution 9 achieved a global exposure never imagined by the artists who pioneered its techniques. So he goes into talking about Burroughs and Cage and Stockhausen, and saying basically that Lennon's sortie into sonic chants was packaged for a mainstream audience which had never heard of its progenitors, let alone been confronted by their work. So he's saying the power of the Beatles to bring a piece like this into the mainstream was the only time this is really ever done with numbers like this. So this guy, John Taylor, who called this very weak analysis, I mean, I couldn't see how you could miss the point more. This is somebody with an agenda, somebody who is butthurt and can't take a little bit of criticism of his favorite band, and he responds over emotionally. So this book, the reason this is so good is it's written really for 3 different kinds of an audience, I think. So academics, it's written for them, it's written for the casual fan, and it's written for the musicologist as well. So the analysis covers all those areas, so I don't know how you could do better analysis. So we have another mental giant here by the name of James Davies, who says, I hated Revolution in the Head. No idea why it's still so revered. Too much personal opinion as well as uninformed guesswork and needlessly slagging off songs he doesn't like instead of actual critique. It was the slagging off of Sexy Sadie that was the final straw, and I couldn't take it anymore. So we've already talked about Sexy Sadie. I mean, if you get negativity out of that, it's mild at best. And so when actual critique goes against some people's opinions, they start mudslinging, calling MacDonald names, calling them uninformed guesswork. You know, they say psycho bashing. As I said earlier, you may not agree with some of his opinions, but the analysis is still very good. Now, one of the things that he does critique the Beatles on, this surprised me. I had never heard anybody say this before, but he's rather hard on the Beatles' lyric writing. And throughout he talks about it, but I'm just going to read to you something because people also take offense to this. But I want to just bring some of this around for you here. So in talking about lyrics, he says early in the preface, rather than tell a story in a traditional Tin Pan Alley style, Lennon and McCartney wrote their lyrics to create a mood or a tone, so as not to get in the way of the effect created by the music and the sound. This bred a casual attitude to normal sense, which later turned explicitly free associational. There was always just enough sense in a Beatles lyric for the listener to get the general idea. The rest came from the sum of the parts of the record as a whole. The Beatles rarely thought long about their lyrics. So that's one part. And he's probably right, because we've heard the Beatles use placeholders in their songs, and some of those placeholders remained in because they gathered meaning as they developed the song. I guess the most famous one is "The Movement You Need Is on Your Shoulder," which was a placeholder for Paul, but John said, no, I love that line. So he kept it in. Here's another part that I want to read about lyrics. All that can be ultimately said about this aspect of the Beatles' output is that it need not have been so, that they could have written lyrics in a more traditional style, but this would have made their songs and records very different from the way they are, and perhaps far less alive with overall spontaneity. After all, no traditional lyricist could compose music like the Beatles. The comparative vagueness of their lyrics is the price we pay for their main inspiration, their musical originality. So he brings it around, that the spontaneity and the musical, the sound, just the energy of the Beatles was the focus. The melody is really the focus, not so much the words. So that's where I think he's coming from when he's talking about the lyrics. And there's a lot of analysis regarding lyrical style and writing here. I find it quite interesting. In addition to some of the negative critique of the songs, we talked a little bit about the negativity on some of the lyric writing of the Beatles. He also talks about some of the harmonizing too. So this is another negative thing that people may have had a problem with, but just listen to how he writes this. He's talking about harmony errors. That there are a few small harmony errors in the early records merely shows them to be human. What is surprising, given their work rate, is that there aren't 3 times as many. There are more mistakes with lyrics in early Beatles records than with harmonies, and we must remember that the singers were also playing instruments. McCartney sometimes singing while simultaneously playing a bass line in quavers, and winging to a girl in the front row. That's good writing. Now, that is some of the negative stuff that he says, but he does it with flair, he does it with style, and it's so cleverly written and well written, and that's why this book is special. Another thing I like to bring up about this book is the fact that it's got a couple things in the back that are rather interesting. First of all, there's a chronology of the 60s. So the existence of the Beatles roughly from 1960 to 1970. He breaks down in a graph all the Beatles releases and everything going on around at the same time. That would include, the UK pop charts, current affairs, culture, films. So that's really interesting that he broke it down that way. There's also a glossary of terms he uses. He uses some musical terms that, if you're not a musician, you may not know what those are, but he's got a glossary in the back for that if you care to know that stuff. And finally, he's got an index of songs and what keys they are in. So as I mentioned earlier, for the musicologist, this is pretty handy, actually. And it's not a big part of the book, but it's in there if you want to see it. The other thing I want to talk about is, if I can find it here, one of the criticisms I hear about this book, they like to rip on MacDonald. MacDonald, by the way, died in 2005 by his own hand, I believe. And they like to say that this book is dated. So he talks about new music, which had been in the early 90s when he was writing this. And it's fascinating how what he wrote in the 90s is still slightly ahead of its time now. Or it's of its time now. It could have been written now. Let me read you something. And let me know what you think here. And he's talking about rap music in this particular part here. Admittedly, the rap and dance music created in the late 80s and 90s has displayed much rhythmic inventiveness within the confines of total mechanization. Rap at its best being a dazzling combination of street doggerel and vocal drum solo. Yet the effect of presenting rhythms by drum machines, and later by drum samplers, slaved to sequencers, has been to elevate the groove over every other musical priority. At its simplest, this means that songs are written from the rhythm track upwards rather than from the melodic harmonic idea, as was the case in almost all 60s music, apart from that futuristic inventor of funk by James Brown. What he says about new music, to him which would have been in the early 90s, can be completely applied to today's music, and it makes total sense. He's really quite brilliant in his analysis of the current music of his time. So this book does have several detractors, and mostly by fans, and typically they will say he's unqualified, or he has weak analysis, or he hates the Beatles. All those are completely wrong, and anybody who says that really probably isn't adult enough to read this book. Now, my audience here, you guys I know are all good at sniffing out the bullshit. I'm sure you've seen these kind of comments about this book before, and I would say if you haven't read it yet, ignore those, and you're going to be in for a treat with this book, because it does the Beatles great justice, I believe, and really almost all the way through speaks very highly of them. Well, that's it for today's video. I would like to do more book reviews, and I've got a pretty big stack. I don't know which ones to do next, but more are coming, and a lot of you have suggested I do some more. So I like doing them, and I'm glad to hear that there's some demand for them, because people aren't reading books much anymore, are they? They're watching videos like this. But I thank you for watching, and if you haven't already subscribed, please do so, because then my videos will come right to you much more quickly. Thanks for watching. Pop goes the 60s.